I think I give like most things 4 out of 5 stars to be fair, but I will cry, but that's just because I love this book so much. By a few years ago, I do mean like 7, or watched BBC Merlin and wanted Arthur and Merlin to end up together. I think you'll love this book. Hello and welcome to my 2023 reading wrap-up. My goal for the year was 50 books and I hit it in late December. I'm very excited. I reached my goal. Everything is good. But I feel like this is going to be a long one, so I'm going to get straight into it. I will say I am filming this in sections, so if you see my outfit change, just ignore it. The first book I read in January was one of my favourite books of the year, and that is If We Were Villains by ellaloux. This book follows Oliver, who is being released from 10 years in prison for murder. It's told mostly in the past, set during his time at a prestigious arts college in a very selective Shakespeare program. The story starts with Oliver being released from prison, so you know he has been locked up for murder, so I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the story is basically split in half. The first half of the book follows the build-up to this death, not knowing who's going to die or how, and the second half is trying to find out who did it and why. This story left me staring at a wall, just so desperate to know more, but also not wanting my questions to be answered. I absolutely loved this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because while it was probably my favourite book of the year, I did find it a little bit slow at some points, generally like around the start before the story picked up. If you like dark academia, you will love this book. It is dark academia done properly and well. It is a critique of academia. It is wonderful. The next book that I read is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This book follows Monique, a young journalist who has seemingly randomly been selected to write the memoir of a reclusive Hollywood starlet named Evelyn Hugo. The story is broken down into sections by each of Evelyn's husbands, which I think is a really interesting way of telling the story. And we find out more about Evelyn as a person through the happenings of each of her husbands. I really loved the way Monique and Evelyn's stories kind of converged, and the way that what seemed like loose ends throughout the story really came together. This was another story that left me just like staring blankly at a wall when I finished it. I read this book so quickly, like one evening and the next morning, and when I finished it I felt like so full and so empty at the same time. I think Taylor Jenkins Reid is very good at that type of ending that leaves you just feeling so much. This book has definitely received a lot of hype over the past few years, but I think it deserves every bit of it. This was my first 5 out of 5 star read of the year. The next book I read was Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake. This book follows a photographer going back to her hometown for her stepsister's wedding. She meets one of her stepsister's friends and rom-com shenanigans ensue. I genuinely think I would have rated this book a lot higher if I read it at a different time. I think coming straight after The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo meant that, I mean, nothing was really going to get to that level, and while I did enjoy this book, it just wasn't comparable to The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This book is fun and everything I want from a rom-com. There was even a cheeky little only one bed trope thrown in there that was a very pleasant surprise. But I was borrowing the book from a friend, and so I felt like I had to read it to give it back, and so I read it at that time even though I kind of knew I would probably enjoy it more if I read it later. I gave this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. Now, moving on to February, the first book I finished was Chain of Thorns by Cassandra Clare. This book came out on the 31st of January, and I spent the day at the shops desperately trying to get a copy. My birthday's the 1st of Feb, so I spent my entire 22nd birthday basically sitting there reading this book, like, kind of crying. It is the 3rd book in the Last Hours series, so I don't know how much I can explain about the plot without spoiling anything. I will say this series follows the children of the infernal devices in Edwardian London, which is basically like the best setting for a kind of urban fantasy in my mind. I think Cassandra Clare just really loves breaking my heart. The characters in this series are all so lovable that anytime anything slightly negative happens to them, I am just aching. This book made me feel the full spectrum of human emotion. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This book follows a band coming together in like the late 60s or 70s and finding global success. It is absolutely drama-filled with drugs and affairs and scandal. I read this before the show came out and really enjoyed it. I think the band in this book is very reminiscent of Fleetwood Mac, but I'm pretty sure it was inspired by the drama around the Civil War's breakup, what happens when an affair occurs within a band. This book didn't impact me in a really strong way the way The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo did, but I did really enjoy it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This book follows 6 teenagers who are trying to do a heist to find riches and respect. This book changed me as a person. If you were here in February of last year or March or April, basically at all earlier last year, you will know that this book really was my everything. I talked about Six of Crows in every video for I think 7 videos straight. It was a lot, but I just loved it that much. The characters in this book are just so compelling and every relationship is worth rooting for. If you like found family, you will love this book. This is one of the strongest found families I have ever read. There are 6 main characters and most of them have point of view chapters in this book, and I was never sick of any of them. There's that thing in multiple point of view books where you just kind of want to get back to the characters you like, but every character in this book captured me and held my attention. I think this book is incredible. 5 out of 5 stars for me. I absolutely love it. The next book I read is predictably Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. Crooked Kingdom made me feel just so much. I won't describe much of the plot because if you haven't read it, I do think it's best to go in not knowing too much, but it is just so good. I was spoiled for the fact that something was going to happen at a particular point in this book, and so the whole time I was waiting for it, but knowing it was coming didn't stop me from feeling the full spectrum of human emotion when it did. The Six of Crows duology was on my TBR from the moment I heard about it, which was maybe before Six of Crows was even published. I remember entering a competition to try and win a copy. I did not win, but it was on my TBR from that moment. And then a few years ago, I bought both books and they sat on my bookshelf for years. I cannot believe that I read this series for the first time this year. They have easily become some of my favorite books I have ever read, with the most compelling characters and story that I care the most about. I gave both Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely love this series. It is the next day. Let's continue. March was quite a slow reading month for me, but I started the month by rereading The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. If you somehow don't know what The Hunger Games is about, it follows Katniss Everdeen, who volunteers to take her sister's place in The Hunger Games, a yearly death pageant where 24 children have to fight to the death for the entertainment of the wealthiest citizens of the country. The Hunger Games Renaissance is basically the best thing that's ever happened to me. The Hunger Games was the first book series that I ever came to really love. It is not only the reason I am the reader I am today, but the reason I am the person I am today. I have read this book countless times, but I find every time I reread it, I take something new from it, especially as I get older. This book gets 5 out of 5 stars for me. I think it always will. I love The Hunger Games. The only other book I read in March was Six of Crows. I did reread it the month after I read it for the first time. I love this book. At this point in the year, I genuinely couldn't stop thinking about Six of Crows. Every single day, I would go back and read certain sections of the book. It genuinely took over my entire life. But then it was April, and I basically didn't read all month until the last few days. I ended up having a readathon on, I think, like the 26th or something. So on that day, I finished Crooked Kingdom. Who's surprised? I took notes for this video, and the only note I have for the reread of Crooked Kingdom is I still cried, so I mean, it still hit me. It was still really good. This was like peak, I literally can't stop thinking about Kinej in my life, so yeah. I mean, if you've read this book, you know how it is. It's great. The next book I read in April is 16 Souls by Rosie Talbot. This book follows a 16-year-old boy, Charlie, who can see ghosts around York. He starts noticing that the most famous ghosts around the town are going missing, and meets someone else who can see ghosts, Sam. He starts following the clues to see what's happening to his ghost friends, while also growing closer to the new boy. I read this as part of my readathon, so I read it in a single day and had a great time. It's one of those books that I know I would have been absolutely obsessed with if I read it when I was a teenager. But even now, a little bit older than I guess the intended audience, I still really loved it. If you're a fan of Victoria Schwab's City of Ghosts, I think you'll love this book. They're really similar in my mind. I gave 16 Souls 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read is actually a graphic novel, and that is Demon in the Wood by Leigh Bardugo and Danny Pendergast. This is a graphic novel that follows the Darkling in his, I guess, childhood or as a teenager. The artwork is so beautiful, and it's a really fun piece of lore if you're already interested in the Grishaverse. I thought it was great. I love getting extra pieces of information to stories that I love, and I really think graphic novels are the perfect medium for it. I gave Demon in the Wood 4 out of 5 stars. And the last book I read in April was Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. This book follows Alina Starkov, who finds out she's a sun summoner, a never-before-seen type of Grisha, which is basically a magician, but the characters are like really determined for you to know that it's not magic, it's the little sciences. This was a reread. I think I read it originally during the pandemic, but I listened to the audiobooks while I was at work, so I didn't remember much about this story. I had loved Six of Crows so much a few months earlier, and I really wanted to give this series another go. I really enjoy the world that this book sets up. The story itself is interesting, but I found myself quite indifferent to the main character. I did, however, really love a lot of the side characters. Overall, I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. My first read of May was Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare. This book follows the Shadowhunters of Los Angeles after the events of the Mortal Instruments, in a world where fairies are criminals and even associating with them is forbidden. This is the most political of the Shadowhunter series, but while that sounds boring, it really isn't. I was a bit nervous going into it the first time, but it's actually like very good. The characters in this story are so easy to love. It has found family, and angst, and forbidden romance. I think some of my favourite fictional characters of all time are from this book. This was my, I don't know how many, reread of this series. I wanted to see if it was as good as I remembered or if it was all just nostalgia, and I have to say it was as good as I remembered. If you want to get into the Shadowhunter Chronicles but the Mortal Instrument sounds a bit boring and you're not into like the Victorian England thing of the Infernal Devices, I really do recommend this series. It's modern and fun, and I think you'll like it. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. I think I give like most things 4 out of 5 stars to be fair, but shh. The next book I read was Gwen and Art Are Not in Love by Lex Croucher. This story follows Gwen, the Princess of Camelot, way after Arthurian legend, and the Prince of another kingdom, Art, who have been betrothed since birth. Betrothed is a hard word to say. Blech. This is not their love story. The title is not being sarcastic. They are not in love. They each find out that the other is queer and start blackmailing each other into silence, before realizing they can probably help each other. This book was recommended to me by 2 different friends, and it was the perfect recommendation. I absolutely loved this book and couldn't put it down. Both Gwen and Art and their love interests are absolutely wonderful. And there's a cat called Merlin, which is just so perfect. I loved it. I gave this book 4.25 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in May was Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare. This is the second book in the Dark Artificers series, and I think it might be my favourite Cassandra Clare book of all time. Again, this was a reread. I loved it as much as I did when I first read it. Kit Haringdale has to be one of my favourite fictional characters of all time and maybe the most relatable. This book makes me feel every emotion ever, all at once. And I feel like this says more about me than the book, but I used to have this thing where every time I'd have a drink, I would start talking about this book, like, to everybody. So yeah, maybe that tells you how much I liked it. But yes, I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. Hello, day 3 of filming this. It's 35 degrees today. Let's do this. We are up to June, and the first book I read that month is Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. This book continues the story of Alina Starkov. There are so many lovable side characters. Stumhunt is like one of those fictional characters that will just always be iconic. The story itself feels like a lot of the stories that were coming out around the time. I don't want to say that it fell into most of the tropes of that era, but it kind of did. Still, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Similarly, the next book I read was Ruin and Rising, also by Leigh Bardugo. I was continuing my reread, and unfortunately, I thought that most of this story was quite forgettable. I do think, however, this book sets up the rest of the Grishaverse really well. I do think that the end of this book was quite refreshing. While the story itself is very similar to a lot of the stories of the time, the ending did feel different, and I really liked that. I also gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was King of Scars, also by Leigh Bardugo. It was a big month for me, for Leigh Bardugo. This book follows 3 points of view. Nikolai, the king of Ravka, Zoya, his general, and Nina Zenik of Six of Crows fame. This takes place, I think, 2 years after Six of Crows, 4 years after Ruin and Rising. and follows three of my favourite characters from this world. Zoya's character growth between Shadow and Bone and this book is just extraordinary. I love her. I think Nina's story continues in a really satisfying and real way. In this book, we meet a new side character who I absolutely love, but it creates a really interesting connection with the previous Grishaverse books. I personally really enjoyed this series, but I never hear people talking about it. Six of Crows and Shadow and Bone get talked about all the time, and no one gives King of Scars any love. I love where this book starts. It's such an interesting scene and really captured me. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in June, can you guess it, is Rule of Wolves by Leigh Bardugo. Every book I read that month was by Leigh Bardugo, and I am happy with that. I love the way Leigh Bardugo is able to weave different plots together. So many little things that could have been throwaway lines and little plots that didn't go anywhere come back in this book and tie together really well. This book just confirmed that I absolutely love Nina Zenik. I think the two main romances of this book are absolutely wonderful. If anyone mentions a blue ribbon in their hair, I will cry, but that's just because I love this book so much. My first read of July was another reread, and that is Queen of Air and Darkness by Cassandra Clare. This marked the end of my Dark Artifices reread. I feel like I've said this already, but I love every character in this series. There were so many parts of this book when it came out that were these jokes and memes that are never going to leave my mind. Kit continues to be the most relatable fictional character I've ever read, and the final chapter of this book is just so beautiful and so painful in the best way possible. The epilogue set up the Wicked Powers, which is going to be the last series in the Shadowhunter Chronicles, which I am very excited about, despite the fact that we have basically no news on it. But I am very excited for what comes next for the characters of this story. I am going to put the next 4 books that I read all together, and they are the Heartstopper graphic novels. I have read Heartstopper so many times and loved it every single time. It's such a feel-good story while still tackling some very serious issues. The story follows Charlie, who starts falling for a rugby lad at school. If you haven't read Heartstopper, I really recommend it. It is a graphic novel, so it's quite easy to read and quite quick. If you don't want to read it, I really do recommend the TV show. I think it was cast perfectly and the soundtrack is incredible. I have given every volume of Heartstopper 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read in July was Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I've read this book over 70 times, which sounds like a lie, but it's not, and is a slight problem for me. This story follows Alex Claremont Diaz, the son of the first female president of the United States, who for years has had a rivalry with a prince of England called Henry. After a cake-related scandal, they put on a PR campaign to pretend they were friends the whole time, and save face while also learning each other's hidden depths. It is no secret that I love this book. I think I've talked about it for hours on this channel. This was my final reread before the movie came out, and I am not going to talk about the movie. I will just say that I do still prefer the book. I of course gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in July is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. The Hunger Games is the series that got me into reading, and so for years I was so desperate for more of that world. I bought this book the day it came out, and then it sat on my shelf for years. I finally got to it, and of course I loved it. I don't know why I was nervous. I never should have doubted Suzanne Collins. This book was great. I watched the movie as well, which I thought was wonderful. There were quite a few changes, but they all actually made sense in the context of the plot. This book follows Coriolanus Snow, aka President Snow, when he's a teenager, during the 10th Hunger Games, when he is a mentor. If you're a fan of the Hunger Games, I really do recommend you read this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And then it was August, and my first read of the month was more than halfway through the month and was an audiobook I listened to on a plane. And that is The Charm Offensive by Alison Cotrun. I'm definitely saying that last name wrong. Sorry. I think because I was listening to the audiobook on a very loud plane, I don't remember a lot of the little details. I was also very sleep deprived. All I know is I really enjoyed this book and found it fun and satisfying and a great romance. The story follows Dev, who works on a reality dating show who really believes in fairy tales. Charlie, a washed-up tech bro, is the new star of the show and is cold and uninterested in all of the contestants, but starts to show Dev his true self. I genuinely really loved this book. I'd love to get around to rereading it just because it was so fun. This book had asexual rep, which I find so rare in romance, and was wonderful to see. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I listened to the audiobook of this over a few weeks, and so I didn't feel like I connected to the story as well as I could have. I'd love to reread it at some point, especially because there is another book following maybe the same characters that has come out since. The story follows Viv, an ex-mercenary who wants to open the first coffee shop in her city. The problem is, no one actually knows what coffee is. This is a cozy fantasy. It was sweet and lovely, and I'd love to give it the attention that it really deserves. Despite feeling disconnected from the story, I did really enjoy it and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And the final book I read in August was I Kissed Sharawilla by Casey McQuiston. I have loved both of Casey McQuiston's other novels, but was nervous because this was their first young adult. I should never have doubted them. I absolutely loved this book. The story follows Chloe Green, who is almost done with her Christian high school, but things go astray when cool girl Sharawilla kisses her and goes missing. Chloe needs answers and spends her last month of school looking for clues as to where Shara has gone, along with Shara's boyfriend and bad boy neighbor. I really wasn't expecting the beautiful found family that was in this book. I read this on a beach, and I think that was the perfect setting for it. It is summery and fun, and I just had such a great time. If you've liked any of Casey McQuiston's other books, I really do recommend this. If you're a little bit younger and maybe Casey McQuiston's other books are a little too mature for you, I do really recommend this book. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. We are up to September, my biggest reading month of the year. The first book that I finished in September is Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. This book follows an angel and a demon trying to thwart the end of the world because they've come to really love Earth. I really loved the show, so I wanted to give the book a go. I was also interested in trying out both authors. I started reading the book physically months before and just couldn't get into it. I think it's the font that it's actually printed in. I just couldn't read it. So I did pick up the audiobook and finished it in September. I really loved the footnotes that are included in this book. From what I understand, that is Terry's style. But I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and it's made me want to dive into both authors' work much more. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Six of Crows, and I have no comment. I feel like we've been through this. I read this book so many times in 2023. The next book I read was The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. This book follows Monty, the son of an earl who has been kicked out of boarding school, and his best friend Percy, who are about to embark on their grand tour. Monty's sister is tagging along to be dropped off at finishing school, despite her many grievances, and everything goes wrong when they're given a chaperone and attacked on the road by highwaymen. This book has everything I love. There are the most lovable pirates, and alchemy, and a sinking island, and cure-alls, and a main character who is so messy and in love with his best friend. This was a reread for me. This was one of my favourite books a few years ago, and as I was taking notes for this, I did realise that by a few years ago, I do mean like 7. Which is wild, because it was my second last year of high school. It was a long time ago, but this book's great. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy, also by Mackenzie Lee. This book follows Felicity, who is trying to become a doctor, but finds herself at an old friend's wedding as a mystery unfolds. Felicity is wonderful, and so are the side characters. I think this book in particular is really character-driven rather than plot. This series has like a fantasy element. In The Gentleman's Guide, it is alchemy. The fantasy element in this book, I'm not going to say because spoilers, but it's just so fun. I genuinely think about the fantasy element of this book constantly. I loved it. I also gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read is The No Woman's Guide to Scandal and Shipwrecks, also by Mackenzie Lee. I was doing a reread of the series. I had only read this book one time beforehand when it first came out. This is set decades after the first two and follows the youngest Montague brother, who never knew he had older siblings, but tracks them down while trying to find out what really happened to their mother. I had completely forgotten the plot of this book from the first time that I read it. I remembered like a few minor details, but I was so surprised by how much I loved this book. I particularly really loved the main character and was quite shocked as to how relatable I found him. I absolutely loved the sibling dynamics between the 3 Montague siblings, and just the story is very fun. This one also got 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This story follows a woman who goes viral after posting a video about like a robot alien thing that she thought was an art installation. This book was political in a way that really surprised me, but shouldn't have. I've been familiar with Hank Green for quite a while and kind of had assumptions about his political views, but they are very clear and blatant in this book. He didn't hold back, and frankly, it was wonderful to see. I genuinely really loved this book and was moved by it. I was still compelled by the story even when I didn't fully understand the kind of tech stuff going on. I was still just very captured by the story. I love it when books discuss and dissect fame, and the way it can kind of change and corrupt people and the way different people deal with it. This book was absolutely excellent, even as someone who doesn't read sci-fi. I loved this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars and I really recommend it. The next book I read was Crooked Kingdom. Again, no comment, we've been through this. I really want to reread this right now. The next book I read was A Beautifully Foolish Endeavour by Hank Green. The story continued and the politics of the author were even clearer. I really loved this book, but wasn't expecting the almost body horror that was a part of it. I was listening to the audiobook in a car, driving through like beautiful scenery and just kind of being met with this like horror. I don't find things very unsettling when I read, but this genuinely was just kind of ugh. I really do recommend this series. It was so good. I can't really say much about this sequel because it does give away a lot of the first book, but please read it. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall. This book follows Viola, who was presumed dead during a war and used the opportunity to start truly living as herself. She lost her connections to her wealth and her best friend, a duke named Justin. The story follows them re-meeting, as Viola realizes how much the loss of her meant to Justin and how much she truly felt for him. This might be one of the best romances I've read for a long time. It was genuinely moving, and I find that I don't particularly care about romance very often. I can't speak to the quality of the trans rep, but I have heard good things. I was listening to the audiobook and didn't pay attention to how far along I was and thought it was ending about a quarter way through. I was genuinely moved by this story. I really loved it, and if you're interested in historical romance, I think you'll love it too. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The last book that I read in September was a non-fiction, the only non-fiction that I read all year, and has one of those really long non-fiction titles, so I am going to read it directly off my phone. And that is Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Angela Chen. A few hours have definitely not passed, but let's continue. This was the only non-fiction I read this year. This book was an intersectional look at asexuality. I thought I knew a decent amount about asexuality, but this book taught me so much. It was very informative. It opened my eyes to so many different experiences and was so educational without being clinical or cold. Every story in this book felt very, very human. I don't really know how to review non-fiction. I clearly don't read much of it. I will say, if you're interested in learning about asexuality, especially from an intersectional perspective, I really do recommend this book. I gave Ace 4 out of 5 stars. And then it was October, and I only read 2 books the next month, from something like 10 to 2. The first book that I read in October was the new Percy Jackson book, The Chalice of the Gods by Rick Riordan. This follows Percy Jackson on yet another quest, this time in hopes of being accepted into New Rome University. I enjoy the Percy Jackson series. I've read it a few times, but I've never gotten super into it. I haven't read all of the other Riordanverse series, but I enjoy Percy's original story. I really enjoyed this edition, and it got me super excited for the TV show that was coming out a few months later. Overall, I'd say it's just a good time. I gave Chalice of the Gods 4 out of 5 stars. The other book I read in October was a reread, and that was One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. One Last Stop follows August, a girl who was raised kind of as a private detective, who meets a very charming girl on the train named Jane. The only problem is that Jane is stuck on the train, and has been, since the 70s. I read this book when it first came out. I'm a big fan of Casey McQuiston's other work, but this reread was just so good. I really did love it so much more this time around, even though I did really enjoy it the first time. The romance is satisfying, Jane, the love interest, is compelling, and the overall dynamic between the two is just fun and wonderful. The found family elements of this story are genuinely heartwarming. Without spoiling much, there's a scene that takes place during a birthday where a group of people go to the train, and I think I might have actually cried reading it. It's just so wonderful. I really, really love this book. I gave One Last Stop 4.5 out of 5 stars. I just realized these books are the wrong way around. Oh. Anyway, then it was November, and it was NaNoWriMo. I was not reading much. I finished 2 books, and I want to take a moment and let you take just a wild guess at what those books might have been. Are your guesses in? It's Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, again. I want to read to you exactly what I wrote in my notes. For Six of Crows, I just have, it was NaNoWriMo, my brain couldn't handle much, and I was yearning for the crows again. Fair. And for Crooked Kingdom, I've just said, don't at me. So, don't at me, these books are really good. Can you tell that this video has been going on for too long and I'm starting to maybe lose my mind? But then it was December, and I realized I had to read a few books to catch up to my goal for the end of the year. The first book I read in December was So This Is Ever After by F.T. Lukens. This book was recommended to me by a friend, and it was a great recommendation. This book follows Eric, who was the chosen one who has defeated the big bad and now has to rule the kingdom. But being king comes with a catch, finding a spouse to be magically bound to. He starts trying to pursue his friends and quest mates, and realizes that maybe the person he's been looking for has been right in front of him the whole time. I loved this book. I listened to the audiobook in basically one sitting and honestly loved it. It was fun and whimsical and adorable. If you like Friends to Lovers or watched BBC Merlin and wanted Arthur and Merlin to end up together, I think you'll love this book. I gave So This Is Ever After 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read in December was Imogen Obviously by Becky Albertalli. This book follows Imogen, who is the world's greatest ally, until she realized that she might not just be an ally. I've enjoyed quite a few of Becky Albertalli's books, but this one might be my favorite. I think she just writes such good coming-of-age stories. This one in particular seemed to be fueled by her own righteous rage towards the outing situation that she went through a few years ago. There were a few moments in this book regarding friendships souring and kind of looking back at your previous memories and realizing that things weren't ever that great. And that felt like a bit of a slap in the face. I think that it's an insanely relatable thing to look back at previous relationships and realize that maybe the red flags were there all along. This book was great. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I'm pairing the next 3 books together because they're all from the same series and I can't really talk about much in any of them without spoiling the first one, and that is Carry On, Wayward Son, and Any Way the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell. Carry On follows Simon Snow, the chosen one, trying to save the magical world while also keeping a very close eye on his roommate who he thinks is a vampire. I've read this series a few times. It's not my favourite thing. It's fun enough. I had the audiobook available to me and listened to audiobooks to fall asleep, and so I was listening to these ones. I personally have quite a few problems with this series and they do drag a bit for me in the middle, and this might be a good or bad thing depending on who you are, but it feels like every Drarry fanfiction I read in 2015. So yeah, depending who you are, that might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. This series is fine. It is just very fine to me. I generally give all of the books about a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I would bump the first one up to a 4 if I was in a good mood. And the final book that I read in 2023 was Heartstopper Volume 5 by Alice Oseman. I love the Heartstopper series. I talked about the rest of them earlier. I will say this one didn't have much going on. It feels a little bit repetitive, but also it's Nick and Charlie, it's cute, it's fun, you kind of get what you're expecting. I can't talk about this book without spoiling the others. It is the 5th installment. It's good fun, it's Heartstopper. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. So there we go, the 50 books that I read in 2023, despite how many times I called it 2013. I had reading goals at the start of the year. Some I achieved, some I didn't. I hit my one goal of hitting 50 books. Good, great, fun. I didn't hit my goal of mostly reading new to me books. I started the year off strong, of very rarely rereading books, but by the end of the year, most of my reads were rereads. I also kind of lost count on how many times I reread Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. It was either 4 or 5 times, which is quite a few considering I read 50 books, and if I read these 2 books 5 times, then that's 10 books, and that's a fifth of all of the books I read this year were just Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. I'm personally not mad about that. Those books are great. Why did I just look like a teapot? If you've stuck around and made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. This was a very long one. I'm sorry. Are you interested in any of these books? Did you read any of them in 2023? Let me know what your favourite read of the year was in the comments down below. If I had to pick one single favourite book of the year, that is actually a very difficult question, but I would say either Six of Crows, or If We Were Villains, or The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I've read a lot of good books, especially at the start of this year. But yes, this was a very big video to film. It has taken me days of filming, and I can't imagine how long it's going to take me to edit this. So again, if you've stuck around, thank you so much. If you liked this video, give it a like. You can subscribe. I talk about books all the time. I upload every week. But that is all for today, and I will see you next time. Bye. Without spoiling anything. Okay. Basically all of the tropes of the time. Ooh, heat's getting to me. I think this is round 4, maybe? Is Good Omens by Neil Pratchett and Terry Nope. A Lady for a Duke by ellaloux. I read this book so many times in 2013. Oh god. And the final book I read in 2013. No! Oh my god. The first book I read in December was I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Eric. It's spelled like A-R-E-K. I've seen a lot of strange spellings for Eric. We're going with Eric.